And without further ado, getting into this first segment here, I have Manny on with me. Manny, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. I'm very excited to be here. I've seen some of your shows before. Just now, me getting into the network and getting accustomed to it, and it's a lot of good stuff. And I'm excited to come on here and talk with you about the Steelers and just football in general.
Absolutely. So, on that note, our first subject of the day is Justin Fields, obviously one of the biggest storylines across the NFL for this offseason, as the Bears have the number 1 overall pick and they are expected to take a quarterback. Still aren't necessarily committal on that just yet, which sort of leads to all of these debates about what they should or shouldn't be doing with Justin Fields, and also sort of if they do decide to move on from him, where should he go? So the story behind Justin Fields, of course, is we've seen the flashes from him. It's just a matter of necessarily the consistency. We know the top-end talent that he has, but just bringing that all together, it hasn't necessarily panned out in Chicago yet, partially due to maybe some of the rawness that he came into the league with, but also to some level, the front office of Chicago not necessarily putting him in the best position to succeed. And this is something that you talked about during the week on your show. So, in your opinion, would you consider the Bears front office to have failed Justin Fields through these, first key years of his career?
I think I would put it like that. Yeah, I think so. Just because I mentioned it on the show that if you want to compare him to the other quarterbacks that he was drafted with, Trevor Lawrence, Zach Wilson, Mac Jones, and you kind of see how they all panned out in both situations. Mac Jones and Trey Lance included, Zach Wilson, they were all kind of in that situation that Justin Fields was in, and Trevor Lawrence was too for an extent of time with Urban Meyer. In that class, for the first year, wasn't looking the best. They were all struggling with their teams. It wasn't looking good. But the only one that kind of got the help, got the improvement, made the changes that was required was Trevor Lawrence. They brought in Doug Peterson. They brought in his old college running back, Travis Etienne, not to mention Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram. All this stuff to help him. Most of the stuff I just mentioned was offensively. And you saw the jump that Trevor Lawrence made on top of being talented, the generational type of quarterback that he was. The reason why he went number 1, he got all the help that was required of him. For a period of time, the Jaguars were struggling a lot with the record and not being good. They got him that help, and I think it changed a lot for him. And just compared to the other guys, you see how much bringing in that help could change an outlook of a career so early on.
Yeah, definitely. And like you talk about with that whole draft class, it's interesting because 5 quarterbacks selected in the first round, and yet none of them have looked all too fantastic. We saw Trevor Lawrence and the improvements he's been able to make the past couple years after they sort of started investing into the offense and surrounding him with some better talent. But all in all, we've seen a lot of turnover with coaches amongst these 5 teams that took quarterbacks. And, we even saw our first one of these guys end up moving teams with Trey Lance this past season. We are sort of expecting that Mac Jones and Zach Wilson won't be back as the starting quarterbacks of their team next year. But I think it's interesting with the Bears here because it's not for complete lack of effort. The situation that he walked into was not great. I mean, Darnell Mooney has been a solid, good wide receiver, but it wasn't until this past season where they actually traded for a true solidified number 1 receiver in DJ Moore. But even before that, they still attempted to. They traded in 2022. They traded their second round pick, which ended up being the number 32 overall pick in that draft, for Chase Claypool, who really flamed out, never panned out there in Chicago. And I think that there are a handful of moves now that we can look back with Chicago's GM Ryan Poles in terms of making some nice additions, but I think that at the same time, you look at the offense that's been surrounding Justin Fields, and it hasn't been too stable for the most part. So I think that it sort of makes sense as we go forward here to try and get a fresh start. I'm not sure where you are at in terms of whether or not the Bears should be looking to trade Justin Fields versus uses the picks. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things I saw was, I think just on ESPN or an article that I read that, the Bears kind of mindset, their feeling behind it is that they're not moving on from Justin Fields for a lack of talent, that they think he's bad, he hasn't done a good job. It's just because they feel that the situation as it is isn't favorable for him to stay, and they feel like they could get a better talent in Caleb Williams, which is the presumed number one pick, right, at this point. And just on that, it's moving Justin Fields in that situation as it is. It's complicated for the Bears and everything, but I just think it does come down to that it takes a lot for an organization to realize that, yeah, it didn't pan out. We might have failed you, or it just didn't work out, to have that maturity and be like, we're going to do good by you and by us and just move you on. It didn't work out. Because a lot of times I feel like they'd keep him around or just trade him somewhere else where they might not do very well. And this time I think Justin Fields, wherever he goes, it'll probably be better. And for the Bears as well, it's going to be good because they're going to most likely get at least the 2 for him. I don't know what it's looking like. I don't know what your thoughts on it, if you want to comment on that, what he could get. Or what the Bears could get for him, but I think a 2 would suffice. And if they could get a late 1, I think both parties would be satisfied with that.
Yeah, I think that for me, I sort of look back to that draft class a few years ago. It was 2018, I believe, when Josh Rosen was the Cardinals' first-round selection, and then just the next year, they had the number 1 overall pick, and they decided to go with Kyler Murray. Josh Rosen never proved anything, never showed any of the potential that we've seen from Fields, and yet they were still able to get a second-round pick and an additional pick in day 3, I believe. So I feel like we're probably looking somewhere along those lines, and I think that that's the right decision for the Bears because, like you said, it's not a decision in terms of that there's not talent there with Justin Fields. I mean, he was 7th in the league as a whole in rush yards in his second season in the league. Like, we know that there is clear athleticism that sort of raises your floor. And then this year we saw him make improvements in the pass game as well. It's just a matter of a little bit of inconsistencies at time and not being able to string it together for long stretches. And as he comes up on this big payday at some point where he has his final full year under his rookie contract, and then whether or not a team's going to pick up his 5th-year option or give him a bigger extension, that clock is sort of ticking. And for the Bears, I think that it's not often, I know that they had it last year, but it's not often to get the number 1 overall pick in the draft. So I think that that's probably the right decision to go with. Now, earlier on the show, earlier in the week, that is, you talked about the comments that Justin Fields made on the St. Brown's podcast and between the brothers there. And he talked about just wanting to know what the direction is for himself in the future. How much of an obligation do you think that the Bears have to Justin Fields in this situation in terms of keeping him updated with what their plans are?
I think because of how public it's all become, right, at this point, of how much media attention it's picked up over the last few days, weeks, everyone talks about those comments that you just mentioned about just the situation in general. I think there is an obligation there for the Bears to keep them updated because they're in a situation where they might not outright say it, but they're looking at a guy that's coming in for his job, his spot. So I think just from that standpoint, Justin knows it, they know it, and just to keep that good relationship, because it hasn't gone malicious or anything of that sort between the Bears and Justin. Just from that standpoint, I think they'll keep him updated, and just reports that I've seen show that this deal could probably potentially get done pretty soon with the combine coming up next week. I think that's where most of this is going to break down, and most of it's going to get finalized, and we're going to potentially see a deal get done sooner rather than later. And just keeping them updated that way, I think it'll be best for both of them to just, get it done with, get it into the past, and just move forward from there.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously there's all these elements between, the business side of the league, but also the personal side, where every player that's in the NFL knows that it's a business, but there is still a very real human aspect. Justin Fields is likely going to have to move his entire lifestyle to a different location, and just, for a person in his early 20s, that uncertainty has to be, very heavy on his shoulders. You talked about on your show the social media aspect of this, where he's unfollowing NFL related users just for the sake of trying to get his headspace away from this whole debate and just sort of find an escape anywhere he can. So it's tough, because if the Bears openly said that they're going to trade Justin Fields, they probably in turn get a little bit less of a package for him, because other teams feel like they've given up some of the leverage there. And that's what all of these deals are about, is leverage. So it's this very interesting sort of thought experiment, I feel like, behind the psychology of the business that goes on in these leagues. So that being said, we're sort of still on the same page about, we're assuming it's going to be a fresh start. Quickly here, as we wrap up the first segment, do you have a specific team that you would like to see Justin Fields play for?
I would probably say, putting all my biases aside, I'd probably say the Falcons. I think it's more likely, just because I've seen the Steelers not showing too much interest in him. People say that they're interested. It makes sense that he goes there, but I think the Falcons are more active with it. And, he's from Atlanta. They have a boatload of talent there, young talent that just seems to be waiting to be tapped into. And I think he could unlock that. They have new coaches, a new offensive scheme. I think he'd fit in well with the Falcons.
I agree. I think the Falcons are probably my top team that I'd like to see them play for. Just with the weapons that they do have there, I think that they're coming in with this a little bit new of a nuanced offense. They bring in Zach Robinson, a first-time offensive coordinator, but somebody who's been around football for a while, used to play in the league, worked for Pro Football Focus, so from a very analytical standpoint, he has been engulfed in the game of football before holding a bunch of roles with the Rams, so I think that would be a pretty good fit. I've also had this sort of, sneaky liking for him going to the Seahawks. First off, I think he would just look really cool in a Seahawks jersey from an aesthetic standpoint, but with the receivers around him on the perimeter, obviously Metcalf, Lockett. I'm a big fan of Jackson Smith and Jigba, the first-round rookie they drafted last year. And with those running backs as well, I think that they could have such a diverse, fun offense to run with. But Seattle did have an out to save themselves almost $13 million if they had cut Geno by last Friday. They did not do so. So I don't think that that's happening, but I think dark horse-wise, that would be a really fun fit. You mentioned putting your biases aside as you are a Steelers fan. They definitely have questions surrounding that quarterback position, and it is one of the many discussions going on amongst them headed into this offseason. So on that note, we are going to be taking our first break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be talking about the outlook for the offseason with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So stick with us, and we will be right back.